Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third seminar of 2016 by IUCN in collaboration with Maldives National University. Today with us we have Dr. Jillian Hudgins, and she is from the east coast of Canada. She holds a PhD in Earth Sciences, and she has been working on marine conservation issues in the Maldives since 2011. From 2013, she has specialized in sea turtles and citizen science projects, and she has also worked with IUCN and MRC to develop the TURTLEWATCH citizen science project. She has also worked in the RIDLEY project since it began in 2013, and this project is focused on preventing ghost gear and studying its interactions with the marine life. Today, she will be talking about sea turtles ecology and conservation in the Maldives. So now I invite Dr. Jillian to give a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? It's okay? Okay, so I'm going to start just with some basic biology of sea turtles. Turn this on. So sea turtles are marine reptiles. That means they spend their entire lives in the sea. They like to live in nice warm water like here in the Maldives. And like all reptiles, they breathe air. So most turtles can hold their breath 20 to 30 minutes on a dive. They're very long-lived animals, and they mature late in life. Usually they start reproducing, laying their eggs around 20 to 30 years of age. So they grow very slowly. And although they have a lot of babies, they reproduce very irregularly, perhaps every 2 to 4 years. So this is why, one of the reasons why all 7 types of sea turtles in the world are listed on the IUCN Red List as either vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. So this means that they are at risk for disappearing forever or becoming extinct, and they really need our assistance in helping those populations get back to good levels. So the life cycle of a sea turtle begins on the beach. The mother comes at night onto land. She lays her eggs, usually around 100, 200 soft shell eggs. She buries them. She can nest 4, 5, 6 times in a season, usually about 2 weeks apart. And then she goes back to her foraging area. So she has no maternal care of the babies. The eggs take around 2 months to develop and to hatch, and the babies are fully independent when they hatch. Again, they normally hatch at night and run down the beach at night because, of course, this is the safest time in terms of predators. And when they're running down the beach, they do something very important. This is when they imprint the magnetic signature of their birthplace in their mind. So sea turtles can sense the magnetic field, similar to other reptiles, other birds. And this is how we think they can navigate across the oceans. And it's important that they remember where they were born, because they go out in the open ocean, in the deep water. This is why we never see little baby turtles on the reef here. They're in the deep water. They're hiding usually under some sargassum weed, finding food, and they can float very far. So a turtle born here in the Maldives can float over to Indonesia, over to the Seychelles, where they find a nice reef to settle on and start foraging and finding food. But then when it comes time to breed, they use that memory, that magnetic signature, and they make their way all the way back here to the Maldives in order to breed and lay their eggs. So they can migrate really, really far through international waters, through the waters of multiple countries. So that's why their conservation is such a tricky issue, because it involves the government of multiple countries cooperating together. So I mentioned there's 7 types of sea turtles in the world, and we're lucky here in the Maldives there's been confirmed sightings of 5 of those sea turtles. The most common, of course, are the hawksbill and the green turtle. They make up 99.9% of the sightings here. The olive ridley, sometimes seen offshore, and I'll talk more about that turtle in a minute. And the leatherback and the loggerhead, very rarely sighted, and if they are sighted, it's usually in deep water or channels between the islands. So the hawksbill turtle is the most common sea turtle we see when snorkeling, when diving on the reefs. It lives on coral reefs, forages on them. It's named for its sharp, pointy beak, like a hawk's bill. And it uses this to rip soft corals and sponges and sea anemones off the reef. So this makes up most of its diet. This turtle is actually considered critically endangered throughout the world. So this is the last category before extinct. So throughout the world, the populations have gone down drastically in the last couple of decades. But actually here in the Maldives, this is one of the best places to swim with hawksbill sea turtles. It's thought to be one of the highest populations, if not the highest foraging population of hawksbill turtles in the Indian Ocean. And we have a lot of juvenile hawksbills here, so small turtles around 40, 50 centimeters, not mature yet. So that's a really good sign that it's either a great spot for juvenile sea turtles, hawksbill turtles to come and forage, or that the population is really recovering from being exploited over the last couple of decades. The green sea turtle, don't see so often on reefs, but quite common to see it up in the lagoons, eating seagrass. As an adult, this turtle is vegetarian, so its diet consists completely of algae and seagrass. It keeps the seagrass very healthy by cropping it. And this is the most common sea turtle we see nesting here. So although there's lots of hawksbills foraging here, not so many hawksbill nests. The opposite is true for green turtles. So we don't see so many when we're snorkeling and diving in the water, but they make up most of the nesting population of turtles here. And you can see they look a little bit different from the hawksbill turtle. They have a rounder head, and they're a little bit bigger turtle and lighter in color from the hawksbill. And the last turtle I'll mention is the olive ridley turtle. This is an open ocean species. The smallest species of sea turtle, only growing to about 70 centimeters in size. It spends most of its life in the open ocean, so we don't really see it close to shore. And it has a very varied diet. It eats pretty much everything it can find out in the open ocean. You can't be too picky. So it eats jellyfish and algae and fish and crabs, all sorts of things. And actually, just a few days ago, this sea turtle is not confirmed to have nested here in the Maldives. There's never been any confirmed sightings. But just a couple of days ago, 2 olive ridley hatchlings were found in Laviani Atoll. So this is the first confirmed nest of the olive ridley sea turtle. And there's also been anecdotal reports of them on the beaches as well. So perhaps we have 3 species of sea turtle nesting here. How do you tell a male and a female apart? When hawksbills and greens, all species of sea turtles, are juveniles, it's very difficult visually to sex them. But once they reach adult size, the male sea turtles grow a long tail. So it will extend more than 10 centimeters past the edge of the carapace. So it's very easy to visually sex them in the water. The age of maturity is not well known here in the Indian Ocean. It's actually thought that most species of sea turtle are a little bit smaller than their Indo-Pacific and their Atlantic counterparts. So we measure a sea turtle's carapace, either a curved carapace length, so measuring the curve, or a straight carapace length in a straight line. And there's a certain size at which they reach maturity. So I worked with a marine biologist here at Coco Palm, and she took pictures of a sea turtle over about 2.5 years. And in her first pictures from July 2013, this sea turtle was around 58, 59 centimeters, curved carapace length. And it had no tail, or no visible tail. And she took pictures of it over in about 6-month intervals. And in September 2015, she noticed that the tail was starting to grow. So this was in fact a male. And now you can see in February it's got a great big long tail. It's definitely a mature adult male. So this study helped us sort of narrow down the age of maturity of male hawksbills, at least here in the Maldives, to above 60 centimeters carapace length. So why are turtles important? Why should we conserve them? They're important culturally, of course, across the Indian Ocean as a source of food. They're present in many traditional dances and traditional songs. But now they're very important for tourism here in the Maldives. People come from all over the world to swim with these animals. And as I mentioned, this is one of the best places to get up close and experience sea turtles in the water. But they're also very important for the ecosystem. So green turtles being vegetarian, I mentioned they eat seagrass. And seagrass is an important habitat for baby fish. It acts as a nursery where these fish can grow up, be safe from predators, and then go out in the water, and they're the fish that we like to use as a food source here. But seagrass also helps to prevent erosion, and I see many resorts now taking the seagrass away because people think it looks ugly and maybe they think it doesn't belong there and they would prefer a nice white stretch of sand. But then you see them a few months later coming with their sand pumps and pumping sand back on the beach and spending lots of money. So that seagrass really helps prevent erosion because it has nice strong roots, keeps the sand in place, and once that's taken away, all the sand washes away and onto the reef. Other species control populations of jellyfish or populations of toxic sponges. So they're what's called a keystone species. So that means without them, the reefs would look very, very different. In terms of natural predators, sea turtles, they have a nice large shell, hard shell, they're fast swimmers, so they don't really have any natural predators as adults, except for large sharks such as a tiger shark or a bull shark, which we don't see too often here in the Maldives. The hatchlings and the eggs, of course, are the most at risk, either from being dug up or when the hatchlings run down the beach, birds, crabs, sharks, and fish. So very few survive to their first year. Perhaps 20% or less survive that first year, and then even fewer survive to adulthood. And then compounding that, all of the human threats that we pressure them with, from throwing our garbage in the water, catching them accidentally, killing them for meat, the survival rate can be 1% or perhaps even lower than that, perhaps even 1 in 1,000. So there's many threats. Around the Indian Ocean, I mentioned sea turtles were used as a traditional food source, as an alternative to protein to fish. But sea turtles aren't really the healthiest meat that you can be eating. Like fish, if they're at the top of their food chains, like some of the larger species of sea turtle, they're bioaccumulating toxins. So that means they're eating fish or organisms which are contaminated, and that goes into their body. So often turtles are found with a very high bacteria or parasite load in their tissues, heavy metals and chemicals. And the hawksbill turtle especially, because it eats toxic sponges, has a chemical known as chelonitoxin in its bodies, and it can make you very, very sick. And the mother turtle passes those toxins and bacteria onto her eggs, and cooking them does not remove these chemicals and parasites. And I was at a resort just last week where 4 staff members had actually been taken to hospital because they had been eating the fat from the sea turtle, and they became very, very sick. So throughout the Indian Ocean, not just here in the Maldives, there needs to be more enforcement, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. The tortoiseshell trade, if you don't know, tortoiseshell is made from hawksbill turtle. The shell of the hawksbill is beautiful, and it was used for a long time to make jewelry and combs and glasses, and it was a valuable item in Asia. And Maldives was one of the top exporters in the Indian Ocean until about the mid-1980s. This material is banned by CITES, so the Trade of International Species. But unfortunately, I've been in a few tourist shops here in Male, and they're still selling tortoiseshell items, which they say have come from Sri Lanka. But I think, and I work with people working at resorts, there needs to be more awareness amongst tourists to to let them know that this is made from a critically endangered species, then they shouldn't be buying this, because I'm not sure everyone is really aware what exactly they are buying. Loss of habitat and disturbance is a big problem all around the world, from development, either resort islands here or local islands, building a harbor in a nesting area, building seawalls where turtles can no longer get in. And also artificial lighting is a big problem for hatchlings. They usually go towards the brightest light, which is normally the reflection of the moon on the water. So when there's a resort or a village behind them, they get confused and disoriented, and they head inland into the jungle or on a road where they cannot obviously get to the water. So it's encouraged, if there is a sea turtle nesting site, that all lights be turned off, for it to be very dark. And mother turtles also prefer very dark, quiet areas to nest. So often when a resort is built or an island develops, those sea turtles that nested there will move to a nearby sandbank or a nearby uninhabited island. Bycatch is another big problem worldwide. Thankfully, this isn't really a problem here in Maldives due to the type of fishing that you practice here. So pole and line is very selective, which means there's not many animals that aren't targeted as catch caught accidentally, so sharks, dolphins, turtles. But it is a big problem elsewhere, especially in longline and trawling fishing, and India has a very high level of bycatch. So whenever I speak with tourists, I encourage them to look for this symbol when they go home and they're shopping for tuna. So this is the International Pole and Line Foundation symbol, and the Maldives is part of that foundation. The tuna fisheries here are certified, so that when they're shopping for tuna, they can be sure that they're supporting a sustainable fishing method. And something that's very popular here, and I often talk to school kids about, is keeping turtles as pets. So I get it, they're very cute, and people like to keep them as pets. And it's often done with very good intention, because I mentioned that first year of life for turtles is the most difficult to get through. So people think, and I think this message has spread throughout the Maldivian community, that if you keep turtles for that first year, grow them bigger, and then put them in the water, they'll be fine, they'll survive to adulthood. But in fact, people are keeping them in very poor conditions. So I've seen turtles in buckets of dirty fresh water, they're being fed Pringles and boiled eggs and tuna sandwiches, and of course they're not healthy, right? They have all kinds of eye disease, and they're biting each other. And they also don't get a chance to stretch their muscles and use their muscles and really develop that fitness that they need. So it'd be if, like, you were laying in bed your entire life, and then someone said, right, you got to get up and you got to run a marathon, and a lion's going to be chasing you. You're probably not going to be able to do it. So the sea turtles, when you put them in the water and they've got to swim away from all these fish and sharks, they don't have the muscles or the fitness developed, and they're probably not going to make it. And under the new legislation, which I'll speak about in a moment, you do require a permit if you want to do any rearing or raising of turtles. So really the best thing to do if you find a hatchling is to let it run down the beach and then take it out in a boat in the deep water and place it into the deep water, and then it will have a better chance of survival than it will at home in your garden. Marine debris is a big problem for turtles worldwide. As you can see in the difference, you can see the difference between the plastic bag and the jellyfish, but unfortunately the turtle doesn't know what the plastic bag is, and lots of turtles now are ingesting not only plastic bags, but lots and lots of our other waste. So nobody wants to eat a fish that looks like this, smoking a cigarette butt with a safari packet. But in fact, that's what we are eating. When we place our waste in the water, I've seen fish eating cigarette butts and plastic, and then you go and catch your supper and you're eating those very fish that have all of those chemicals from your cigarette butts in them. So unknowingly, you're just eating your cigarette butt and your waste. So I've been visiting local islands in the past couple of weeks, doing a lot of education with schools, separating the waste, putting it into the bin, sending it off, and not throwing it in the water. So I mentioned there was a new legislation, and this came into effect on the 4th of April by the Ministry of Environment. So for the last few decades, it's been illegal to catch and kill turtles. There's been a legislation under the Fisheries Ministry. But the eggs were only protected on a certain number of islands, and there was always sort of a gray area about the rearing of hatchlings. Was this allowed? Was it not allowed? But now there's sort of a blanket ban on all the whole life cycle of the sea turtle, from harvesting eggs and disturbing nests to catching and killing adult sea turtles, rearing turtles, and importing and exporting any turtle material. So this really covers the whole life cycle, and this is great. And I was just shown a post by the Ministry of Environment that 3 people in Lamu Atoll were actually fined today. I think it was 12,500 rupiah for keeping turtles as pets. They were fined and they had to release the turtles. So this is wonderful that the ministry has put this this legislation to effect and is enforcing it, because of course laws on paper are wonderful, but the enforcement and showing people that you are serious about this is really what's going to change people's behavior. So I'd like to speak a little bit about some citizen science projects that are happening here in the Maldives and ways that you can get involved in conservation. So what is citizen science? It's basically public participation in research. So it means that you don't have to be trained as a marine biologist or a scientist to really participate in these programs. They require minimal training. You can get involved, and the data that you can collect can really go towards conservation or saving this species. And why does it work? Because it gives us the ability to collect a lot of information over a very large area in a very short amount of time, using citizens as volunteers. So it's very cost effective. You don't have to hire multiple researchers and have them out in the field. You do minimal training. You can spread your work base very wide. And using tourists as citizen scientists is really effective, because there's loads of tourists here in the water with cameras, observing animals. And people really want to give back to conservation while they're here on vacation. This sort of ecotourism brand is now becoming very popular, especially in North America and Europe, and people really want to have a feel-good experience while they're here and get involved. There are some drawbacks though. Obviously the quality of data we get is not the same as if a scientific researcher was out there in the field. You get blurry photos, you get people that can't confirm species ID, and you have inconsistent data because of course you have sporadic reports from here and there instead of a systematic study. So I'll talk a bit about some of the citizen science projects that are happening here in the Maldives. So the first is a Sea Turtle Photo ID program. I've been working on photo ID for a couple of years now. There's other photo ID programs going on for manta rays and whale sharks here as well. And if you didn't know, sea turtles have a unique pattern on the side of their face. This is like their fingerprint. It makes them unique. And if you have a series of photos over time, you can get an idea of the movement of certain turtles. You can get an idea of the population structure. And it's a good non-invasive way to study populations because you don't have to touch the turtles, you don't have to take a sample. You can involve citizen scientists because people are there with cameras anyway, so why not use this information for science? The next project I'd like to talk about is a project by IUCN and MRC developed last year, and this is the TURTLEWATCH Maldives project. And the aim is to collect standardized data on marine turtles in their feeding and their foraging area, because we really don't have a good idea of the population size of turtles here, green hawksbill turtles, either nesting or foraging. So there's really no baseline data that exists from decades ago that we can compare numbers to now. So we don't know if the populations are going up, going down. So TURTLEWATCH Maldives was designated for this, and also to spread awareness about threats to local communities and really to empower them to get involved in sea turtle conservation. So it involves 2 protocols: in-water observations, so basically counting the sea turtles you see, reporting their sizes and the sex of the turtle if you can, and a nesting protocol as well. So if you'd like to get involved in this, you don't have to be based on a resort island. It can be when you go for diving on your local island. You can email this address here, and Hadija Ali is here from MRC, and she's the coordinator of the project, so you can speak to her and get more information about the Turtle Watch program. And part of the Turtle Watch program involves nest protection, particularly on local islands, but also on resort islands. They still have a problem of reporting nests and protecting nests from staff that are working there. So on the left side, we have tracks from the sea turtle. So I often go around to resorts and work with the people out cleaning the beach and the gardeners, show them pictures of this so they make sure that they know what a sea turtle track looks like. And then you can fence off the nest, put up a sign so that everybody knows that it's there. And on some islands, it's better just to erase the tracks and camouflage the nest and protect it from people that may want to take the eggs. So whether you fence it off, whether you don't, is really dependent on the island that you're working on. And you can identify the species of sea turtle that nested based on the tracks. So the green turtle has symmetrical tracks about 1 meter wide with a tail drag. And the hawksbill turtle has asymmetrical tracks, less than 1 meter in size, and no trail drag in the middle. So if you do happen to see a sea turtle, if you're on your local island, on your home island, be very quiet and do not touch the turtle. And please do not use flash photography or a torch. This can scare the animal. She may stop nesting and turn around and actually go back in the water. And if you do see a nesting turtle, please do report it to the Turtle Watch program so we really get an idea of where turtles are nesting. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to focus on the threat of ghost nets. And this is what the Olive Ridley project is focused on, the association between sea turtles and ghost nets. So what are ghost nets? You may not have heard the term before. It's basically a collective term for lost, abandoned, or discarded fishing nets. They may be lost for a number of different reasons: bad weather, catching on the bottom. We've heard stories of fishermen cutting each other's nets because there's such huge amounts of competition now for very few fish. And in many places, there's no proper place to dispose of the nets. So the fishermen are somewhat forced to just throw it overboard because maybe they have to pay a fee to take it to a landfill, or maybe there is nowhere to take it. So these nets, they look something like this. We usually see a big tangle of nets. They're made from plastic, polypropylene or polyethylene. Some are made from nylon, and plastic, as we know, lasts basically forever. It lasts hundreds of years. It does not break down. It's very strong, and they're called ghost nets because they continue to catch fish with nobody on the other end. So they can float for years. They can cross ocean basins. So this is what we call a transboundary issue. Again, something that involves the cooperation of multiple governments on an international scale. So these cause problems not only for turtles. We've had reports of sharks, manta rays, whales, stingrays in these nets. They smother reefs. You can see on the right-hand side, a net is tangled on the reef and just basically destroying the reef, bringing disease, can bring invasive species. But they also cause problems for fishermen and for local communities. Of course, they reduce the aesthetic appeal of beaches and of reefs, which can, in fact, impact tourism. They can catch on propellers of boats and cause costly damage to boats. And also, they continue to catch fish, but nobody is financially benefiting from this. So in coastal communities where there's artisanal fisheries, people depending on these fish for their meals and for their welfare, it's really depleting the stocks of fish without anybody benefiting, and making it difficult also to keep track of the fish stocks because, of course, nobody knows how much these nets are catching. So the Olive Ridley project was developed in 2013, and we're now a registered charity in the UK. We started here in the Maldives basically in response to the number of sea turtles we are seeing entangled in these fishing nets. So we started training volunteers from fishermen, resort biologists, local island people, divers, how to rescue turtles, what to do when they find a turtle in a net, how to take that net out of the water and take some simple measurements of it. And then we started working with coastal communities around the Indian Ocean in Pakistan and India to measure the nets that they are using and try to trace the nets we're finding here in the Maldives back to their source. So this isn't just a problem here in the Maldives or the Indian Ocean. This is a problem worldwide. Wherever there's fishing nets being lost. So the UN recently estimated that 640,000 tons of ghost gear goes into the ocean around the world every year. So this is a big, big problem, but not just here in the Maldives. Here in the Maldives, you don't use these nets. I mentioned we fish with pole and line, a sustainable way of fishing. So where are these nets coming from then? Unfortunately, you can see the position of the Maldives here in the middle of the Indian Ocean. This is a time lapse of the currents over a number of years. So you can see the Maldives is getting hit with the currents coming from Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, coming from the Bay of Bengal, and also coming from the east coast of Africa. So we have a really unfortunate position here of being kind of a trap for everybody else's garbage, including our own. We've recognized 3 problematic fisheries throughout the Indian Ocean, and those are gillnet fisheries, and those are basically a curtain of net with weights on the bottom and floats on the top. And we've had reports from Oman and Iran where they set 11-kilometer long gill nets. So can you imagine anything getting past that? And if that breaks, you have 11 kilometers of nets drifting around the Indian Ocean. And that's just one fishing boat. Trawling nets are a big problem because they're dragged sometimes along the bottom. A rocky bottom, of course, is going to tear those nets and rip pieces off. So they are a big contributor to ghost nets as well. And the last is purse seine fishing using drifting FADs, or fish aggregating devices. So this is basically a square of bamboo with a net hanging underneath. And fishing boats let hundreds or even thousands of these objects go. Sometimes they have a tracker, sometimes they don't. And then the ones that manage to aggregate fish underneath, the purse seine boat goes and picks them up. So they wrap a net around everything and they take it out. And the ones that drift off and they never have fish underneath, well, they keep on drifting. There's currently no legislation in the Indian Ocean for fishing boats to go and pick these objects up. So there are thousands of drifting FADs floating around in the Indian Ocean. And these are coming from the western Indian Ocean, usually from the Seychelles, where there's a big European tuna fishery operating there. And they look something like this. And we see a number of them ending up here in the Maldives. The other half of the year, we get nets from the Bay of Bengal mostly, where nets kind of get stuck in a gyre up here and then are spit out. And these are nets mostly from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. So taking measurements and tracing them back really help us designate where these nets are coming from. But some attachments also give us a clue as well. So often we find bottles made in India, floats with Thai writing on them. And one in particular we tracked to a specific boat. So this is a GPS tracker on an FAD. And it came from a Spanish boat operating out of Seychelles. So we know exactly which boat dropped that off and let it go. And we did email them to ask them if they wanted it back, but they never answered, surprisingly enough. So often we find turtles like this. The lucky ones are at the surface, able to breathe, and they're dragging this big conglomerate of not just nests, but this guy's got a plastic box, he's got a tire, he's got some ropes. And you can see why they go into these nets. There's loads of fish and crabs in them, so it's a great place to find food and find shelter, but unfortunately they end up looking something like this. And the lucky ones drift by where somebody can find them and cut them out of the nets. So we've spoken to fishermen here in Male, and they mentioned that they see 10 to 15 of these ghost nets offshore per day, and most of them have turtles in them. And thankfully, a lot of the fishermen we spoke to here said they do often cut the turtle out of the net, but then they leave the net there, so it's just going to catch another turtle. So in the last 2.5 years, we've had reports of over 240 entangled turtles now, thanks to our volunteer base here in the Maldives. And 91% of those were olive Ridley turtles. So this is the main species we find. 85% of those turtles were released alive, but of course we cannot know their fate. We don't know if they survived. Normally they have superficial injuries, but they could have some internal problems that could mean that they can perish in the future. So the olive Ridley turtle I mentioned is the #1 species, and this is because they're an open ocean species. They're naturally attracted to flotsam, so mats of algae or big tree trunks floating by. It's an area where fish aggregate so they can find some food and rest. And they're using these big nets as the same. So they're finding food and shelter in them, but unfortunately they're getting entangled. So these are the results from our 2-year study, so up until July 2015. And as you can see, the majority of turtles we find in nets, unfortunately, are juvenile turtles. So they haven't even reached reproductive age. And we've now trained 500 people on this reporting protocol. Most of the sea turtles we find entangled in nets are between December and about April, so we usually have a peak of reports around January time. And our reporting has increased in the last year. Last year there was more than 100 turtles reported rescued. This isn't just because more turtles are floating in, this is because we're training more and more people to report this to us, to rescue turtles, and they send us reports on Facebook or via email. So it's great, the message is really spreading across the Maldives and people are really getting involved in this project and helping out. So if you yourself want to get involved, you can talk to me. I can give you our protocol on how to report an entanglement. And basically, we need 3 very simple measurements. We need a measurement of the net that you found, the mesh size, so from knot to knot. So you find a net like this, and we just ask you to measure the distance between 2 knots. And this tells us the basic type of net that it's used for and what fishery it's coming from, because small nets, small mesh size is obviously catching small fish, and bigger nets with bigger mesh size, like this one, is obviously catching a bigger fish. So we need the measurement of the mesh size, the thickness of the twine or how thick this is, and then a report of any animals entangled in the net, and if you find a sea turtle, just the approximate size of that sea turtle. So we only require 3 things, a very simple reporting system, and it can be reported online through our website. So what do you do if you find a ghost net floating in the water? Of course, your safety is the most important. If the sea is rough, if there's sharp objects in the net, sometimes there's sharks underneath, of course, consider your safety first. Wear gloves, watch for hooks and lures. And I mentioned sometimes people cut the turtles out of the net and then leave the net. So we really encourage, I mean, that's great, you save the turtle, but that net's going to keep catching other animals. So please take the net. Sometimes they have to be dragged behind boats. And if you can't take the net, if you found a net, you can report it on our Facebook page. You can tell us where it was, and we can mobilize our network of volunteers, and somebody will go and get that net. If you do find a turtle, there's some ways that you can handle it. So pick the turtle up by the carapace, either like this, by close to the neck and the base of the tail, or like this on the side of its shell if it's a smaller turtle, and use multiple people if it's an adult turtle and it's big. So do not pick the turtle up by the flipper where it's already entangled, and don't drag it up by the net, because you're just causing more injury and stress to the animal that's already very injured. Again, beware of your safety. These animals are very strong. Even though they're injured, they can really hurt you, either biting you or getting you with their claw or slapping you with their flipper. So just be aware, don't put your hands near the mouth. And place the turtle in the shade, upright, not on its back. If you place the turtle on the back, it can crush the lungs. The weight of the organs can crush the lungs. So we encourage people to place the turtle upright, place something underneath, like a tire or a pile of rope underneath while you're untangling it. You can cover the turtle with wet towels, place one on its head, it usually calms down. And then usually the turtle can go right back in the water. Normally, again, it just has superficial injuries, some cuts, maybe some lacerations around the neck. So most of the turtles can go right back. If you're unsure, you can contact us through Facebook or through email, and we can put you in touch. There's 2 rescue centers at the Four Seasons Resort that keep injured turtles, assess them, and until they can be released back in the water. So there is some place where they can go and they can be taken care of. So we've now expanded our network of projects throughout the Indian Ocean. So we started here in Maldives, and this is our biggest project, but of course the nets aren't coming from here. So we have people collecting information in Thailand now. We have people doing fishing surveys in Bangladesh and on the west coast of India to get some measurements of those nets. Last year we started a big project in Pakistan promoting cooperation between the fishing community there and the diving community. So the fishermen were losing lots of nets, and they were also reporting reduced catches. But they're not divers, so they don't really know what's under the water. So the divers were reporting loads of nets on their diving site, and they didn't really want to take people there because, of course, it's not nice to dive on a bunch of old nets. So we brought those 2 groups together. The divers showed the fishermen photos, and they made the connection between their reduced fish stocks and those nets being on the reef. So now when the fisherman loses a net, they call the diving community, and the diving community goes and takes that net right away and returns it to the fishermen, because this is a very poor community we're working with. They don't want to lose nets, but they are because they're forced to buy cheaper and cheaper nets. So we've had great success, and we have wonderful volunteers in Pakistan. And we're starting a similar project in Oman, where they're reporting lots and lots of nets on the reef. There's a big diving community as well. So we're trying to make that link again between the fishing community and the diving community. So here are some photos from our other projects. In Pakistan, it involves a lot of work, educational work, with the fishermen, talking to fishermen through translators, and really getting that fishing community together to look at solutions for reusing these old nets. We're now working with an art community in Karachi, Pakistan, to create some art projects out of old nets, and they've started incorporating them into building materials as well to strengthen the buildings that they're making in this small fishing village. I mentioned this is a global problem, and there is an organization called the Global Ghost Gear Initiative that we are part of. There's organizations from around the world working on ghost gear related issues. Sometimes it's issues related to dolphins or whales in that particular area, or seals. Here it happens to be turtles. So the aim is to cooperate together, to share information, to reduce and prevent ghost gear all around the world, and really save as many marine animals as we can by doing this. So to summarize, the goals of the Olive Ridley project are to determine the fisheries in the countries that create the most ghost gear, identify where, when, and why animals, and specifically the Olive Ridley turtles, are interacting with ghost gear. So maybe we can go to these hot spots and try to prevent that interaction from happening in the first place. And to reduce the amount of ghost gear and sea turtle entanglements by working together with a number of different stakeholders. The fishing community is really, really important because, of course, they're the ones losing the nets. Working with municipalities to provide bins where nets can be dropped off. Working with the diving community because, of course, they want to see sea turtles when they go diving. They're able to go in the water and clean up those nets. So there's lots of different stakeholders that need to be brought together on this project. And now we're focusing on, specifically here in the Maldives, on reusing and recycling these nets. And we're working with Project Damage Control, so we have a couple of people represented here who are collecting the nets for us now, looking at ways to recycle these nets. So here's some photos from different projects around the world. This is a sea turtle sculpture made out of ghost nets from Australia, where Aboriginal rangers are really getting very creative with the nets that they find, making baskets, making sculptures. And these sell for thousands of dollars to art museums in Europe. There's a project in the Bahamas that it's making jewelry out of ghost nets. Here we have some placemats. And one really cool project making skateboards out of ghost nets, made out of the monofilament line, the nylon nets. So they recycle this and they turn it into skateboards, which is really, really neat. So there's lots of uses for these nets. They don't have to end up at Tilafushi burnt and then creating a lot of chemicals in the atmosphere. So we encourage you, if you have any ideas, you can get creative and make something out of these nets. And Rai, who is here, did a project at Amilafushi Resort with a ghost net. He created a kind of a coral frame or coral propagation from the ghost nets. So he strung up ghost nets on a metal frame and he inserted pieces of coral to make a coral nursery. And they grew. And I went to check them out last week, and they're 8 years old, and the coral's beautiful. It's really grown into full colonies, and they're ready to be transplanted back on the reef. And new pieces of coral can be put into those ghost nets because, of course, they're not breaking down. We can reuse them again and again and again to make these coral nurseries. So this is a great initiative. There's lots of different ways to reuse these nets. So in summary, I'll leave you with the message to get involved. There's lots of citizen science projects happening here in the Maldives, lots of opportunity to contribute to turtle conservation, or if you're into mantas or sharks, there's lots of projects going on that you can get involved in. And really go back to your friends and your family to really spread the message about respecting the environment. Go snorkeling, go diving, go see the beauty of the environment here in the Maldives, see what you have, and really work to protect that environment for the future. So thank you very much. My font went weird, I'm sorry. If you'd like some more information, you can visit our website or find us on social media, and thank you very much for listening.
If you have any questions to Jill? Nope.
I don't think it's on.
Any questions?
Thanks for your presentation. Sit over here. You mentioned that there's issue with the legislation, like that the per se nets are not legal. Have you guys tried policy avenues to work on that, or is it mainly just on the lower end?
Yeah, that's kind of beyond our scope of work. My colleague Martin did go to the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission meeting a couple of years ago and bring up this issue of ghost gear. So we did make some noise, and they have realized that this is a problem. In terms of changing policy, there are gear marking regulations that are coming into effect in the next couple of years. As far as I know, in terms of FADs, policy is still yet to be changed. I don't know all the specifics on it, but we do hope to go to another Indian Ocean Turtle or Tuna Commission meeting and raise this issue again and just keep pushing it. Yeah.
Thanks for the good talk. Jill is really informative. I always learn, actually, every time I hear the talk, especially because you're increasing the reach of the project, which is really interesting. And it's actually where the project needs to go, right? It's the connections between the countries. But I had a similar inquiry, like Alexis, in terms of policy, and it's a really important part of the project. Looking at regional or international policy and conventions that kind of like tie in the different countries and what they're committed and obligated to do, I'm not quite sure if the Indian Ocean Task Force is at that kind of policy level. Have you thought about maybe things like MARPOL, for instance? So, where, countries that have ratified that convention are obligated to do something about dumping of things in the ocean.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, with that, you have a number of countries that haven't ratified. Maldives, I think, is one of those countries that haven't ratified. But what do you think about MARPOL?
Yeah, that's true. And with these FADs, most of these boats operating out of the Seychelles are European boats. They're French, they're Spanish. They have signed on to this agreement. There's just there's no legislation at the moment in the Indian Ocean. There's no real enforcement. A lot of places have observer schemes. The Indian Ocean is really is lacking. The coverage of observers is lacking, and that's one of the reasons why we joined this global Ghost Gear initiative, because it has more power. You know, this alliance of international organizations, it's run through the World Animal Protection. So they have, you know, if we're this larger voice really kind of forcing these organizations to change, then maybe it will help, instead of, you know, we're the only ones in the Global Ghost Gear Initiative from the Indian Ocean region. So if we're just one voice, it's easy to ignore us, but you know, if it's coming from this international organization, it's a little more powerful message. But certainly that's the route that needs to change. I mean, we can clean up the ocean as much as we want and train as many volunteers, but if we're not changing the behavior of the fishermen, then nothing's going to change in the end.
Thank you for the great presentation. I have one question regarding the number of turtles caught by the net. It seems that juveniles are more on those nets. Can you explain why the juveniles are, the number of juveniles caught on the nets are high?
Yeah. I don't have any for sure conclusions on that. We were actually expecting more adults because the Maldives is sort of on their migratory route. They breed in eastern India and Orissa. So we were expecting more adults, but in fact we found more juveniles. And I don't know if the juveniles are more likely, I think, to associate with flotsam, with these algal mats and, you know, floating tree trunks. Also, the mesh size sometimes is too big for an adult to really get a flipper in, where a smaller mesh size, a juvenile turtle could easily get stuck in where an adult turtle couldn't. So those are my two hypotheses at the moment, but we're not sure. But certainly we are, recently an 8-centimeter juvenile was found in a net. We've had reports of 12 and 13-centimeter juveniles as well. So these are really, really small turtles, probably one year old only. So these are the turtles that are really kind of taking shelter in these types of objects. So that's probably why.
Just out of curiosity, what's the average lifespan of turtles that we see in Maldives?
Between 60 and 90. I'm not sure if anyone's definite, but it's in that range for hawksbill and for green turtles. And the leatherbacks live a little bit longer than that. But most of the turtles we see when we're snorkeling, they're younger individuals. They're about this size, probably about 20 years old.
It's very interesting talk, but I have a question with regard to olive ridley. Because within the Indian Ocean, there have been historical reports of olive ridley in the Maldives, but there is no confirmed nesting, as you say, but you have said some hatchlings been found recently.
Yeah.
But my question is, because there is no residing population in the Maldives, but there are more occurrence during the northeast monsoon, which I believe is a sort of maybe passive transport of the large population of Indian Ocean or of India. So with regard to your theory or perhaps understanding of this migration, is there anywhere else in the Indian Ocean where this Maldives could be a transit point for migration from Indian Ocean, from a nesting area or a foraging area, maybe Eastern Africa, East Africa, that region where there is a large population? Otherwise, I think it's more to do with the Indian Ocean currents and then sort of trickle effect of this large population of Orissa that we see mostly in ghost nets, the olive ridley population. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think, I mean, next year my colleague Martin will be doing some DNA studies, actually, of the entangled turtles we find here, so that we can get an idea of what population they're coming from. So the major population is this Aribata nesting population in Orissa, but there's other populations that nest in Sri Lanka. There's solitary nesting in the Lakshadweeps. There's also a fairly large nesting population in Oman on the other side. So we're hopefully going to use the DNA to confirm that, and then take, obviously, DNA specimens from those nesting populations. I would imagine it's likely, especially during the northeast monsoon, that it is that Aribata population kind of going to and from and passing through the Maldives. But hopefully we can confirm that in the next year or two.
Just one more question.
Yep.
I know that there are some rehabilitation programs, turtle rehabilitation programs. So there are people who take pets out of homes and they rehabilitate it and then leave it into the ocean. So how do these turtles find their hatchling site?
Yeah, that's difficult, and it's not confirmed whether that taking the turtle directly from the nest and not letting it run down the beach, what effect it has on their homing ability, or that ability to come back. That's something that still really needs to be studied. But it is thought that moment when they run down the beach from the nest to the water, that's when they imprint their home beach. So when we take turtles and we raise them, we may be affecting that homing ability. So the best thing to do, even if you do have a turtle that's been in your bucket or whatever for a year, at least let it run down the beach, and maybe even at that stage it may be able to imprint that signature. And you're right, there are rehabilitation places, like there's one in Naifaru that has the sea pen, and they're encouraging the local island to bring their pets and let them practice diving and really develop the muscles and the fitness.
So just a follow-up question on that. What would you say about the Head Start program? So if you had a say, would you sort of allow them or not allow them in the Maldives? Especially, I think it's a pertinent question for resorts, right? Because it's a very popular thing to do.
Yeah, and it's becoming more and more popular. And personally, I'm against Head Start programs. I don't think they're effective. There's been studies in the US and Australia in the 70s and 80s, and it was inconclusive whether these turtles returned and whether it was an effective way to increase population numbers. I think it's more effective to enforce the legislation on catching and killing adult turtles here, let them reproduce, protect the nests, let the hatchlings go. If you are going to interfere, at least let them run down the beach. If you have tourists there with cameras, it's a great opportunity, educational opportunity for the natural nest hatching to let people see it and let them go. I've seen a lot of Head Start turtles with diseases and bitten flippers. They need big areas, and they're solitary animals. They're not used to interacting together. So I think it's more of a tourist educational or perhaps tourist attraction in a lot of places, in a lot of resorts, and they don't necessarily have the expertise to really raise these turtles. I've seen turtles in fountains. I've seen turtles in cages in the wave zone, purely for tourist attractions here. But this was always kind of like a gray area in the legislation, but now it's pretty explicit that this is not allowed unless you have a permit and you have a proper center with the proper people to take care of it, the turtles.
So, I guess the next question, if someone is here from the EPA, is what happens to Head Start programs that already exist? And are they going to shut down or not? I don't know if there's anyone from EPA here.
Anyone here from the EPA?
Rifat is not here? Because if it's not,
EPA
if it's not
back
Rifat,
there?
it's Nizam, I think.
Regarding the existing programs, existing programs have to take the permits from the EPA. So you need to submit. So we have an application form for research application permit. So you need to submit with your proposal and the methodologies to the EPA, and we will be granting permits to do any kind of research, not only the Head Start but any kind of research on all the protected species in the country. But you still need the approval from the Minister of Fisheries to do any research in the Maldives, so you still have to get that permit first. I don't know the procedure is. Yeah.
What kind of situation where it's like Japanese research it's not really
Yeah, so we will be going through the full proposals, and when I say research, it will be the conservation researchers. So EPA will be going through, and there is a reporting format. So there will be different stages for reporting, and the permits is all for 1 year. So you have to renew every year with the proper reporting and other documentation. Yeah.
I have one more question. It's more to do with policy. You must have a lot of experience or knowledge on the policy aspects within the Indian Ocean realm. It's a difficult question for me to put from the, it has long perspective. But my question is to do with Maldives as a country within the center of Indian Ocean. I think Maldives has done pretty good job in terms of policy, because if you look at from historical perspective, from 1960s, 70s, historical anecdotal evidences, there's a lot of nesting in the Maldives, especially green turtle nesting. And then from cultural, social perspective, it's more to do with egg harvesting than rather than adult harvesting. But there are often cases where people crave for turtle meat, so especially green turtle meat as a substitute for, sometimes they refer it as a substitute for beef or similar to beef. Mm-hmm. So with the dwindled population, and then I think from local perspective, the 10-year or 20-year presidential decree without any proper legislation has done pretty good in terms of minimizing the local mortality, because from 1940s or 1950s perspective, the population has dwindled. Mm. So my question is more to do with what are your thoughts in terms of local level efforts in terms of population sort of revival, because I know it takes maybe 100 years from 30s population to come up to a current level, or that level it might take several decades or so. So
yeah,
your thoughts in terms of, because the populations here are not very large. I know it's very important from Indian Ocean perspective, especially the hawksbills, because there's been a lot of work being done by Japanese interested parties who were resort-based originally. So they did a lot of flipper tagging of hawksbill turtles, and then the findings through like 4 to 5 year this tagging and recurring or recapture of these individuals, they thought the hawksbills are more of a localized population, because the foraging range is somewhat like 50 kilometers within reef scale. So they always come back to the reef, but foraging can be found in a larger area. So perhaps these are locally nesting and locally foraging areas, or foraging individuals or population with regard to hawksbill.
Hawksbills, they do have a small home range here, and from photo ID you can see that they really don't move. They stay on the same reefs. In terms of hawksbill, I think the legislation has worked very well. As I mentioned, there's a big population of juveniles. The population is really recovering from the tortoiseshell trade. They're long-lived species. It takes a long time. You know, we're seeing now the effects of the ban from 1985 on the tortoiseshell trade. We're not really sure where those hawksbills are going to nest. It's not confirmed if they're nesting locally, and I think some satellite tracking data may be needed there to see exactly where they're nesting. The green turtle legislation, I think now it is working. A lot of young people I speak to, school kids, they say, no, we've never eaten turtle. I know my grandfather used to eat it, or we used to eat it, but we don't eat it anymore. I think now the attitude is really changing, but I think it did take some time. Unfortunately, we don't have population numbers of green turtles, you know, in the 50s and 60s to really compare the populations now to. I I mean, that would have been really interesting to kind of do a study in the 80s or 90s before this legislation, this ban went into effect, and then, now 20 years later, 30 years later, compare those numbers too, but unfortunately we don't have those numbers. I think still, especially in the north of the Maldives, there's a lot of eating turtle going on from what I hear. But I think now with this new legislation, I'm really hopeful. There's been enforcement, that's great, and I think that's what people need to see. I understand in these small communities, nobody wants to tell them their grandfather or their cousin, that they were eating turtle. It's these close-knit communities, it's difficult, but I think attitudes are changing, and that makes me very hopeful.
I think if we don't have any questions, we have to end, but we do have refreshments. And thank you, Jill,
You're welcome.
for the very informative seminar.